right, let's do this. So this is a crypto API. So what does it allow X509 chain to replace the root trust list for a single call? I read all these words, they're English.
Yep.
So what does it actually do?
All right, so whenever you build a certificate chain, whether it be on Windows, Mac, or Linux, the only functionality that we have right now is when you build a chain, it will tell you whether or not the chain is trusted by the, call it the OS. Sometimes users can influence their personal policy. Things like revocation are only checked if the chain was trusted by the system. This just prevents a certain amount of network waste when we weren't going to trust it, so why bother checking if it's revoked? There are times when people don't want to or can't alter system trust, but they want to know if the chain meets a set of rules that they have. Sometimes it's more restrictive, sometimes it's in addition to, and so then this adds a collection of certificates that we will use instead of the system trust list to determine if the chain is trustworthy. Right now, the trust mode only has 2 values in the enum system, which is do the thing we were already doing, which then it will throw if you put anything in custom trust store because you're misconfigured, and custom trust, or custom root trust, which means we will ignore anything in the custom trust store that's not self-signed. We will ignore it instead of.
When do you throw?
When you call X509 chain.build. So it would say that the policy is in an invalid state.
So I can still set trust mode and add or remove from custom trust store without any interdependency.
The chain policy is just a configuration object. It's when you call X509 chain.build, it validates them.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and then this is an enum because there are several other scenarios that we can envision. Just this is the start small strategy. So default does what it used to do because system is 0, and you can opt into the new behavior. Works on all OS.
Should we, like, it seems a bit weird to have custom root trust and custom trust store. Like, should we just try to align the naming?
Well, because one of the potential other options is custom anchor, which means that you can say that an intermediate should be considered a trust point instead of a root. So they're intentionally different names.
So the trust store could be used for another enum member, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Seems fine to me. Anybody else? Any objections? Looking at you, Levi, because you're the only one with probably more context.
No, I've had this scenario before, actually.
Okay.
It makes sense.
Sweet.
Also, it would make so many of my X509 tests be capable of being written, or written without being flaky.
Yeah.
Sweet. All right, so anybody else on the call?
Was the label?
Oh, Stephen is finally.
So the label was changed to approved?
Yep.
I just did, yeah.
Now the milestone can change the future. Not a critical 3.0 need. It's been on the review radar for so long.
Just want to check the box.
To be fair, I don't have the scenario anymore because I'm not on that team anymore.
Right. And I don't have time to do the implementation.
Yeah.
So
we all feel very strongly about a feature that we don't deliver. That's great. All right, so this is something that we discussed, I want to say offline, but really it's online, like we discussed it on the GitHub issue. So basically what it is there were some customers, particular MVC and EF, that want to reflect over basically our code at runtime, and specifically customer code at runtime, to determine whether something is considered nullable. And their scenarios are pretty mundane in the sense that they make sense, given what the customer would likely expect too. So for example, EF is a little easier to explain, so let's start with EF. So EF basically uses customer data types to effectively create a database on behalf of the user. It's called, the code first approach, where you code up a bunch of types and then basically create a table out of that type. And so very often people want to say certain columns are nullable or non-nullable, and the way it's done today in EF is that you would basically have to apply custom attributes that say this field is required or this field is not required to determine whether the underlying SQL schema is a nullable column or not. And so now that they have nullable annotations in C#, customers will likely expect that they can put a question mark, and then means, yeah, if my first name or middle name property is nullable, then they would expect the database schema to be nullable as well. MVC is very similar. MVC has this model binding approach where when you invoke a controller, they automatically deserialize payloads that come from the wire. They already have a mechanism for validating that payload. It's called model validation, I think. And then the very first line of code that people usually write is like, they say, if model validation has errors, then basically return back an invalid status code or whatever, and then they move on. And so the idea is that when they mark things as non-nullable or nullable, that the model validation would honor that and basically bail if things are marked non-nullable, but the payload is missing the data effectively. And so it would be very surprising for people to say, well, I marked my model type as non-nullable, but when I actually get it back from the controller, I find middle name to be null, for example. And so again, the workaround here is they would have custom attributes they can put on those properties, but it seems largely redundant given that C# has now a first-class feature to do that. So basically the idea is that, okay, how would people do that? And so today the problem is, and I don't have source code in here, but the way the compiler emits effectively the nullability information is not exactly straightforward because there's a byte array involved, because you can have constructed generic types of, IEnumable of string, for example. But those are scenarios that neither MVC nor EF care about. They only care about the top level nullability information, like is the whole property nullable or is the whole method input nullable? And that's a pretty common pattern that I've seen for other people asking for as well. And so the idea is, imagine we would expose that information from the reflection APIs. And so the idea would be you can basically ask the top level entries like the parameter or the method return type or the event property or field, whether the thing is nullable or not. And generally speaking, there's three states. There's the current state of the world, in which case, nothing is recorded, so the state is unknown, can be null, can be not null. And then there's the new state where when you actually put a question mark or you compile it with the nullable turned on for C#. If you don't put a question mark, it's marked as not null. If you did put a question mark, it's considered maybe null. And so this would basically.
How does this interact? Sorry, how does this interact with the variations that can come from the new attributes? Like I can have a non-nullable string that is then attributed as either allows null or disallow null, like for a ref parameter or something, to dictate whether it can be null on the way in or the way out.
Yeah, when I wrote it up, I only basically prototyped it with the nullable attribute, but I would expect that to honor this as well.
But
it will
so
be unknown,
this is pessimistic. Like if there's any chance any direction could be null, it's maybe null.
Yeah, I mean basically the idea would be if you have a method argument, you would basically would have to mirror what C# does as well, right? At compile time, that would basically be the behavior.
Sorry, I'm not understanding what that means.
Like the method that takes a string question mark ref can be attributed as null can come in, but null will never, like if this method doesn't throw, it will not be null once you're done. What does this can't talk about that parameter in a sense other than null.
Right. These APIs, they handle just the very simple case.
Yeah.
Right?
Like my general feeling on this entire thing before we get into any details is because we've been effectively continuing to rewrite the nullable feature until like we ship, that we can't add any API talking about the nullable feature until the next version. Like
that's kind of what I'm getting at. Is there seems to be enough variation that rushing this in at literally the last minute feels dangerous.
Yeah, we're just going to end up with an API that's immediately unusable and we have to replace it with something else because of variations it couldn't describe.
Yeah, what's interesting is that basically we have the custom attributes that I haven't considered yet because when I wrote it up, they didn't exist yet. That's an interesting one. The other question is what do we do with generics effectively, right? Because they would be...
Generics, tuples. I'm not sure whether EF cares about tuples, right? You kind of want to ask, is the first thing in the tuple nullable, second thing in the tuple
Well, generics you can get from parameter info, right? Because the generic type itself is a parameter, right?
Right.
No, parameter info is for method parameters.
Well, that would be...
When
the type parameter
type,
is
Yes,
okay.
it would be type parameter.
Yeah.
So it's a type info.
Right. So I mean, like At the end of the day, once we take all the things that say, oh, if this generic is a reference type, it may be null, and if it's a value type, then it wouldn't be null, and like we'd have to plumb all that in. Like it would make sense to plumb it into the API, but if you're talking about the whatever Jan calls the types that have where you say angle bracket and don't fill it in, like you can't. We don't know the answer
Open
yet.
generic type.
Yeah, so an open generic is still like we have to go back to the like, well, maybe instead of yes.
For
or
open
no.
generics, it would be pretty much the same state as an annotated type. It would be unknown.
Right. So I think that there's just going to be a lot of stuff that this is going to. This will maybe address the 95% case, but the 5% case is going to presume or possibly just invalidate anything we're talking about here.
From the caller's perspective, why are unknown and allows null different? From the caller's perspective.
Because it depends on what you want to do, right? If it, for example, let's say you look at the database schema, right?
Yeah.
You could say, so today EF has some sort of default handling for types where they say certain types we special handle, and we basically say there's a default availability based on heuristics, right? Strings, I think, is one of those, and other things. You would say if the state is unknown, you just use whatever default policy you have, and that may be null or not null, depending on the type.
Okay.
And then you say, well, but if I know the nullability state, then I will just honor whatever the nullability state is. I don't care about the heuristic anymore because
Okay.
the user expressed their intent.
Because I'm thinking like okay, so sure, that makes sense for EF, because I'm looking at this from the MVC perspective, and like MVC is just going to make a Boolean decision, like yes or
Right.
no.
Right. But they could use their existing required
yeah.
attribute
Yes.
as a fallback. for the state.
Also, does this actually affect reflection itself? Like if I have a field that disallows null,
Yes.
will reflection forbid me from calling field
Yeah.
info set value null? No. Should it?
I don't think it should. Like
Okay.
I would say it's the same as at runtime. If you don't null ref, great. If you do null ref, then too bad.
Okay.
Like I think
Yeah,
that's
it's also no different from like I can use a library that's completely 100% annotated and
Mhm.
consume it without annotation, with nullability disabled,
Okay.
which is the default, and then I'm not getting any warnings or anything for
Yeah.
use.
I also don't think it would be practical for us to enforce that because there will be so many cases
Yeah, I don't
where
think
it
it would
would be
either.
very hard.
It just seems odd to me to have null, like allows null as a first class citizen on the reflection APIs,
Yeah.
and then the reflection APIs that actually mutate the values don't honor that.
So it was brought up in the conversation. I think Jan Kobe can speak to that as well.
Yeah.
It's like I think there are some concerns about basically baking C#isms, if you will, into the API.
Yeah.
I'm somewhat sympathetic to that, but at the same time, I don't think of it as a C#ism as much as I think of it as I think about this as a new convention that the compiler, like right now only the C# compiler honors, but F# is planning on honoring them as well. So I think of them as it's a generic .NET metadata feature, right?
Yeah.
And it's not a runtime aware feature, but it's a shared convention, if you will. Now we could put them elsewhere. I just don't know where elsewhere would be, right? I mean, somebody brought up extension methods, which has other problems because now when you have extension methods, you have to decide which types they go on.
Mhm.
And then the other question really is, well, I made them virtual partially because of the way attributes are currently represented in reflection, which is not that great. So if you, for example, have a reflection model implemented over metadata, you can answer these questions much, much more cheaply than if you do it via normal reflection APIs. And so the idea was, yeah, depending on how the model is implemented, you can have a more efficient representation for that. I think the bigger problem for these APIs, which is kind of what Jan also hinted at, is the current design doesn't really, like I make this statement that I don't think we have the time to productize the more general case, which is the INumerable of string question marks. Or how would you know that the inner string is a string question mark?
Yeah.
Because it's tempting to put this on type, but we can't put it on type. We have to effectively give you another way to traverse the generic like composition and then fish the data out, which I think would be a new top level type. You would basically like say, you would start on a particular designator like a field info, property info, and you would basically say, give me your custom attributes, and then as you're walking, if you're unfolding the types, you basically know where in the array we are, and we can give you that information.
Yeah, we could, if we wanted to, not even put this functionality under system reflection. We could put it under compiler services if we wanted to.
Or what about reflection metadata?
So I think compiler service would be bad because that namespace is meant to be only used by the compiler. Those are not meant by use for the compiler, right? Those are meant for people that, like EF, that just want to consume what the compiler did. So they're like reflection APIs, right? I think I think compiler service would be bad because now you're importing a namespace where 80% of them you should never look at, right? Like, you know, the async state machine or all the other machinery that you never have to interact
Yeah,
with.
but I mean, the argument could be made that because the actual runtime itself isn't enforcing any of this, it's not actually part of the type system. It's really something meant for compiler usage. Like,
In compiler services, there are like a number of helper methods that are, you know, meant for rocket scientists, right? These APIs wouldn't be used by kind of people writing regular code. They are like
Yeah.
only meant to be used by other frameworks
yeah, they're meant to be used by people inspecting code.
who are building these like in-place compilers.
Yeah, it's the same people who would be inspecting things like unmanaged
Yeah,
or
yeah.
things like that, in which case I think compiler services or maybe reflection metadata.
Yeah.
The latter in the case of you're not necessarily doing standard reflection stuff, you're really just reflecting over the metadata for the...
I don't see how this is different from normal reflection though. Like to me, this is
It has nothing to do with the type
We-
system.
We have a slightly better mechanism.
Sure, but same is
for-
true with like certain
So
things that you
this
already
is like-
store in reflection. Like for example, default metadata, because it happens to represent the metadata, but it's also not part of the type system realistically. It's just like
Sure.
it's just the like from a user standpoint, it's the most convenient way to acquire that information. I don't think compiler service is what people would expect. I mean, metadata maybe but I think metadata is also fairly low level, so I'm not sure that's necessarily the right one either.
You were saying?
But yeah.
You know, there's like another angle on this, like, you know, basically the decoder for this, like, is super complex, and if you want to make it fast, it needs to cache a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the kind of the fun way to do this would be to have like, you know, nullability decoder object that you instantiate, and then you basically ask question, decode the nullability things
Yeah.
for this entity, and you know it will return you something, and it will cache a lot of stuff along the line.
Yeah, you had actually commented
Right.
at the bottom of the issue that maybe MVC and EF should just have a decoder
Like
and
that
see
would
if
be
it works for them.
right. That
Yeah.
would be the thing to start with, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know,
Okay.
let them build one and see, you know, like what.
That's what I was going to suggest as well. Is given where we are in the cycle, and the fact that we don't even have a compiler yet that implements the metadata scheme,
Yeah.
nor that fully supports all the attributes. We're barely rolled this out across CoreLib, and we're about to ship, you know, Preview 7, which is meant to be the end of API changes. Seems like we should, if we want to build something great, but let's just put it in a source only, like a .cs file that MVC could consume, that
Yeah.
Entity Framework could consume as a private thing. Don't even worry about API shape. It's whatever they want it to be. And then come .NET 5, more of the support is stable, more of the framework has nullability attributes, the compiler is stable with what it generates, and we can revisit the API shape based on the
Right.
needs and the availability at the time.
So, Asen, I know that Steve Harder's not in the room right now, but do you suppose that the JSON deserializer would actually use such a decoder ring if we had it?
I'm not sure. I haven't paid attention.
Okay.
I just think that if we do, I think that not putting in the product's the right decision. I would like to make sure that if both EF and MVC and F# are all going to be needing to use this for, you know, the 5.0 timeframe,
Yeah.
we should make sure we get like a coordinated project that all of them work on together, so we don't have 3 different implementations that we have to.
Yeah, I think the CS file is not a bad idea. Like, I mean, as a starting point, this gives us also, I think, some way to test what the scenarios actually are.
Yeah.
Because one thing that we often also find is that when you actually drill into them, the scenarios are not exactly the same.
And also, you know, like you touched on that, you know, the reflection APIs that exist today to access custom attribute are not exactly, you know, super fast. You know, I think that's something that should be fixed. Because like, if you say, okay, you know, like we have like these APIs, but everybody needs to implement their own to make it actually fast, right? Then
Right.
what's the point, right?
Yeah.
So then, you know, the logic will get out of sync. So I think it's important for the implementations to be on top of the base reflection model.
Okay. I'll also just shoot off a message to Steve Harder offline and just see if maybe we have another consumer of a proposed decoder ring just to get more coverage on it.
I don't think we want it for 3.0.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
I will assert we do
Okay,
not want it for
okay.
3.0.
Assertion, I like that.
We do not have time for more features in the serializer in 3.0,
Okay.
and this is not ready. So
Yeah.
we do not want this for 3.0.
Sure.
I will also add, and this might be the pessimist in me, I get a little nervous about components making runtime decisions based on these nullability annotations, which, while we've tried to make correct, I'm 100% sure we're going to ship bugs in the annotations that we have, and two, there are places where things have been fudged a little bit, like where, well, we don't think it's going to return null, but if it's virtual, who knows, right? And
Yeah.
so making runtime decisions, especially in a serializer, seems dangerous to me.
Yeah, I think realistically what this would be used for is things like link expressions where people want to provide additional warnings towards the expressions that you're building, like in the context of analyzers, rather than hopefully rather than them actually like preventing you from doing something.
No, I think the map scenarios are basically like it either works or doesn't. It kind of they would like. I think if I remember correctly, they would actually change what the thing is serialized as based on the annotations, right?
Yeah, I think for MVC and EF, like I hear what Stephen is saying, but I think most of the scenarios that I can think of in MVC and EF would be customer data types, not ours, right? So whether we get the annotations right is largely irrelevant in that. But I think there's a good question of like what's the bar for runtime features and how do we square our statement that we want to be able to churn the annotations in the framework over the next version until 5.0, probably post 5.0, given that we not get everything in. Well, given that we will add a lot more annotations in the 5.0 timeframe, probably need more time to bake them as well. So most of the time we think of these annotations as compile time breaks, right? But as soon as you have systems that reason about this metadata at runtime, then even if it's mostly customer data code, I don't think you can always describe that boundary well enough, and suddenly we have behavior breaking changes that affect runtime state, right? And that might be a good cause to say maybe we shouldn't build any features until we have sufficient confidence that the annotations are correct. It would also give us more time to make the feature. Yeah.
I think if we had another 6 months before we were locking down and we were already where we are with nullability, we might have a better state, but given that it's been effectively changing day by day, I just don't think we know enough to make.
Yeah, I mean, given the feedback they got offline already, like I kind of assume that we will not do it in 3.0, but it's good to have that list. I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to review it. So how much do people care about the generalized feature here, which is like exposing dynamic and tuple names as well? Does anybody think that's important? Because it's kind of the same problem if you think about how the custom attributes are encoded. You basically have to walk the signature and find the index in the array, and that's kind of the same pattern there for nullable as it is for dynamic as it is for tuple names.
I think it's one of those things where we should be exposing it somewhere because there's other languages that need it, not just even Microsoft languages, but there's community owned languages where they want to be able to interop with the features. And there's link expressions and things like that where you want to be able to use the better names to when you're creating your expressions and still have them map up, yada yada. I think it's just something like it may be C#, but C# so big that it just becomes like the de facto standard. And
yeah, and I could also imagine in MVC especially, you have a method that returns a value tuple, and you just want to have that thing JSON serialized across a wire. So being able to pull the names out would be convenient. Right now, the way you have to do it is by returning an object.
Makes sense. All right, I give it more thought, and then whatever we do, ready for post 3.0.
But that part though is pretty set in stone, right? Like pulling names out of tuples.
Yeah, that one,
Okay.
the feature
Okay.
is done. Like it's just that the problem is basically the same kind of thing where the attribute is not on the types. It's basically on a different thing. You have to call that information somehow, and it's not Super straightforward to build an API
Yeah.
for that.
And with both the tuples and the nullable features, they're making optimizations so they can emit fewer attributes and compress the data,
Yeah.
and then it just becomes like you have to go read the C# spec to be able to know how to walk this properly, and it could change from version to version.
I don't think it
Generally,
can.
why I think they're allowed to compress the data more as long as it's still backwards compatible.
Right, but sure, that one, yes. But like, I mean, I talked with Jared about it. Like, they think that once they have it, they have it. They're not going to touch it because it's almost impossible to reason about that once you're shipped. Like if the feature is basically so that you can have different heuristics in how you apply the compression thing, but the actual mechanics and how you read it wouldn't change. It would just shuffle the attributes around and how it's being emitted. So I think that's probably not the biggest concern we have. It's more interesting to see like what other attributes we will add in the future that could influence that decision making.
Yeah.
And that one I can totally see that we add more attributes. Because you already run into cases in the review where, well, the attributes we have are not expressive enough. So that's the question of how much do we care. All right, so then Steve just joined, so I think then we're done with this one. So I will just move this out of 3.0. Remove the blocking partner because clearly you can unblock them differently. And then let me just do milestone. Sweet. All right, Steve, where do you want to start?
Okay, so this is I think third time through this, and you can kind of read some of the notes from the previous cycle, but basically we met offline as well, and I think the design is pretty close. Some of the naming was up in the air, so there was some renaming done since the last review, but in general the API is the same, except the read and write. The read method now is not try read, and the write is not try write. It's just read and write. And along with that, the read method then simply returns the type directly instead of an out parameter. There's a few open issues I'd like to discuss, but if anybody has any comments to start off.
Comments on what we're seeing on the screen right now, or comments about the scenario, or what?
Anything, I guess, before I talk about some of the open issues,
I'm guessing
or areas that I would like feedback on.
I'm guessing you guys already talked and decided on keeping the create converter method on JSON converter rather than having a separate factory.
Well, it is on a separate base class. No, I mean it was before.
On
We
the
have it on the factory.
on the screen, you've got create converter on JSON converter attribute.
Oh, okay. No, I guess that's the same. So I thought you were referring to the runtime class, not the design time attribute here. This basically allows you to create a custom attribute and add some properties to your custom attribute and then pass those on to the converter. That's all it really does. Yeah, we could move this off and put it somewhere else, but I mean the converter attribute itself needs to be able to do this in some way.
Oh, okay, I see. I see how it works here. I think this one makes sense then.
We had discussed last time potentially making this method public instead of protected. Did we decide against that in the end? The create converter method, that is.
What was the reasoning for that?
The reason for that is no one aside from the JSON serializer itself can call it. Like if you were subclassing JSON converter attribute, how do you test it? You would have to define your own public accessor on the derived type.
Sure.
I mean,
Or you reflect call it, or any of the, I mean, you try using it, or
Yeah, but now what we have here is an attribute not simply that contains metadata, but an attribute that contains logic that's very, very specific to one particular type, the only type that can call into it effectively. That's not generally a pattern we use in the framework.
I mean, the way I would test it though, I don't think I would test it at that level. I would probably configure the serializer and then compare the inputs and outputs, what I expect. I would probably not test the individual.
That's
attribute.
not a good unit test because now you're testing the entire stack all the way up and down rather than just a component that you wrote.
So what was
Functional
your
tests are better.
what was your proposal? Like create.
The proposal was
convert-
make it public instead of protected.
Yeah.
Oh,
Because the other scenario we came up with was, if I'm creating JSON serializer 2, right? Am I going to be able to honor this exact same attribute? The answer is no.
Yeah. That is fair.
Okay, I mean, I'm fine with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's
I-
effectively
the
public API
testability
anyway, so.
Argument, I don't really buy so much, but
Yeah.
the ability for somebody else to reuse this, I guess, makes sense.
Or even if I'm not creating my own serializer, let's say that I mean, the serializer has virtual methods on it, right? Like the serializer has extensibility points. If I use one of those extensibility points to extend the serializer, I need to be able to call the same APIs that the serializer itself would have called.
Yep, sure.
so why does it being protected not allow you to do that?
Because how outside of JSON converter attribute, how do I call it? Like if I'm overriding a method in the JSON serializer itself, I don't have access to this method because I don't have visibility into it.
Yeah, you'd have to create a
You
wrapper.
have to derive from this attribute to get this
Yes,
method.
correct.
It was protected.
Can you override it as protected internal? If it's
Yes,
protected?
I believe you. Actually, I don't know. But even then, like, even if you override it in a derived class, your derived class doesn't have access to call this method in some other derived class.
Well, I mean, if it's protected here and you can override it as protected internal,
Yeah.
which I think you can do, but I'll check.
Sure, let's assume you can for now.
Then you could call it from within the same assembly.
You could only call your very particular subclass from within the same assembly.
Right, but it's virtual, so you would either end up calling the correct overload, or
You would have to cast the JSON converter attribute to my custom attribute before you could call it.
Right.
And that cast might fail at one time.
I mean, honestly, I think on our end it doesn't buy us anything to make it protected. Like as far as we're concerned, it's a public API that we have to reason about. It's an extension point, and whether you make it protected or public does not limit our support costs in any meaningful fashion. It just makes it slightly harder for people to actually test their stuff.
You cannot change access modifiers when overriding protect.
That's
Okay.
a shame. Would have been nice, wouldn't it?
So you'd have to create a wrapper method that calls it, or
Which you could do, at
yeah,
least for
but
testing.
yeah, making it public probably seems best. In the worst case is someone creates an extra converter that they can't really do
Yeah.
anything with except for manually register.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Okay, I guess I'll make that change. Do we want to move on to the JSON converter?
Just one last thing for attribute targets. We are happy with it being on property, class, and struct, and obviously multiples don't make sense.
Do we not want events to be convertible in any way?
Could we do that in the future?
I don't know what that
You
would
could do it.
mean to seal as an event.
I mean, technically, if you have a property, it could be exposing a delegate, and there's really no difference from serializing a delegate and serializing a event, other
Right,
than you
except
really
neither-
shouldn't do it.
Neither of
but-
them are supported.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, this is a converter, so you could manually serialize it.
fair enough.
There are ways you could do it, even if it's a bad behavior.
I don't know if we would want to support that,
Yeah,
though.
I mean,
Yeah.
But we could always add it later.
Yeah,
I mean, event seems something if we want to add it, we can add it, but it seems not something we should support out
Yeah.
of the box.
Because we could always add dot field in the future, too. if we
Yeah, I
wanted.
think field is probably way more likely than event.
Yeah, field should probably.
Well, at the moment, it's not supported, but maybe in the future.
Yeah. We don't need to seal that today.
Anyway, Steve, you were going. Can you hear us, Steve?
Oh, yeah, sorry. What did you say?
Oh,
Now I can hear you.
you wanted to continue?
Yeah, I mean, if you can scroll down, and just keep moving forward, I guess. I took that note. I'll change it from protected to public. Okay, so JSON converter. I think I added the private or changed it from protected internal to private internal, so we don't expect anybody to derive from this directly right now.
I think you mean private.
Otherwise, it's the same.
Yeah, I think you mean private protected. There's no such thing as private
I
internal.
mean, it doesn't affect the public API.
Yeah,
server,
it just
so-
means it's basically not visible from the outside.
No, I meant private.
Protected internal means it is visible outside.
Yeah, private protected, whatever. Like we just don't want it to show up in the reference
Yeah.
assembly, basically.
Right. So private versus private protected is it's not in the ref.
Yeah.
Or rather, it is
So
in the ref.
I didn't
as
wanna-
You cannot extend this.
Yeah.
Sorry, go for it, Steve.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, over. I just put this here to make sure that we realize there's no public, constructor for
Yep.
Yeah.
default.
So can you have two access modifiers like this, both private and internal?
No, the access modifier is called private protected, which is basically internal and protected.
Yeah.
Well, it's not internal and protected. That's protected internal.
It's
Private
irrelevant to this discussion,
Yeah.
though.
No, it's
No, it's
and,
just,
not or.
it's just internal. Just
Yeah,
assume
pretend
it's
pretend it
just-
says internal. Let's move on. It really doesn't
internal
affect
protected
the
is
purpose of
Close
this
that's
discussion.
internal. That's what I meant.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. Basically, there's no public constructor. So basically, you have to derive from what is that? JSON converter of T, right? That's the idea. Which basically has a protected constructor. Protected internal doesn't matter. So the one change you made from last time is that JSON converter factory now is also a JSON converter. Is that correct?
Well, that was a typo from last time. All of the samples had it derived from that.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, we were playing with the API in some offline discussion, and I never changed it back. But no, it does derive from that. The idea of having a common base class JSON converter is that there will be more than one type of converter. Here, there's two different kinds of converters: the factory and then the of T converters. But I think in the future there will be more than two. And the idea is to have one list
Yeah.
containing multiple types of converters that you can arrange and add them in different order. So that's why it derives from the same base class.
If we're going to make it inherit from the base, should we rename create converter to something like get converter? That way it's more clear that you can return self. You're not expected to necessarily return a new instance,
Yeah,
etc.
that was some feedback, actually offline feedback, and further thinking on this is that it did toggle from create to get, now back to create, because the intent is that the framework will automatically cache for you. If you just call get, it kind of seems like that the type itself
Is doing
would
cache.
have caching. I mean, I'm fine both ways, but the argument was brought up that create is a little more correct in the terms of how the framework will automatically cache.
But I think the one pushback I would have is just seeing the word create by default. I would expect you to expect me to return a new instance rather than potentially allowing myself to return self.
Which I think is kind of what Steve is getting at. Like
Yeah.
you don't buy yourself much by doing that, because the idea is that the framework will do the caching at the call side. You should not do any caching yourself.
So you should always return a new instance.
You should probably always run a new instance.
And that's going to be
And
the
returning self doesn't make any sense for this particular converter. Because it'd be recursive.
Okay.
We're saying, hey, the idea is that you're going to give us the proper converter for this type, and you didn't, you return yourself.
So Steve, how do you use that guy that I give you back? So what happens if I give you back basically another JSON converter factory? Do you blow up, or do you then call create converter on that guy as well?
I'm pretty sure, and I'll have to doc this, that there's a valid operation.
So basically you
Basically,
have
the
to
type-
you basically have to return an instance of JSON converter of T, right?
Yes, and if it's not compatible with the T, then another invalid operation will be thrown. So if it's not covariant or contravariant, it'll
Yeah.
throw.
Makes sense because you, can't make it.
I'll dock this, make sure the right exceptions are.
So it must return a JSON converter of T. Yeah, where T is correct.
Yeah, you just can't express that. That's the problem with the type system.
And I'll update the summary then to say that as well. In the future, maybe it could return some other type of converter, but since that's the of T is the only converter today, I might as well just dock it like that.
Are we happy with the JSON converter factory as a name? I think Steve listed a few alternatives that we had just thrown out.
Yeah, last time I had it binder. I think originally I had factory, then I changed to binder, and then I'm. You know what? I didn't like factory, but it is a factory pattern, and just call it what it is. You know.
I mean, the names that you're listed there, that would be all much worse in my opinion. Like, I mean, the average Joe gets what a factory does.
Yeah.
I don't think the average Joe understands the term binder. Like, Shorogate is like, I mean, unless you do a globalization expert, I don't think that means anything to you. And dynamic converter sounds more like it handles dynamic, which I don't think is either the right term. So
Yeah.
I mean, factory is as clear as it gets, right? It's supposed to create instances, right?
And it also has the benefit of it being a suffix, the fact that whatever
Yes.
word we're using, all the other ones have it infixed, which makes it hard to compare JSON converter and this thing.
Yeah, I mean, the hierarchy is a bit on the funky side with JSON converter, but I also don't have a better alternative because I think for the people that just register them, calling those guys converters makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And the people that are extending them, for them it's a bit funky because the converter is not actually a converter, but I also don't have any other naming suggestions that would be better.
Well, I think the other suggestion was make them clearly distinct types and then abstract away the difference internally. That way you don't have to expose the inheritance to the user.
Yeah, but see, that's the thing, right? Like, so it's not about internal versus public. It's more like on the JSON serialization options, you have a bunch of converters that you register, right? So the user that registers the converters, they don't care what these guys do to implement themselves, right? From their point of view, like whether it's a factory or not a factory, it's implementation detail of that converter.
Right, but so what I'm saying was the other proposal was basically you have register converter and register factory. If you register converter, it gets added directly to the list. If you register factory, then internally you could have a converter that does the inheritance chain and wraps the factory. That way you don't have to expose to the user
No, I get that. All I'm saying
the
is that
weirdness of the implementation.
I think there's disagreement on like who you're shielding from this, right? Because I think the idea of with the current design is that the person that just does the registration of the converters, they don't have to know whether the converter itself is a factory or not, right? They just register the converter.
I mean, you probably shouldn't be registering a converter that you don't own.
What do you mean by
Why?
that?
Like, you probably don't want to register some arbitrary converter as like an app or library author. You probably either want the serialization library to do it through the attributes, or you want to be doing it through some well-described mechanism that you've created your own. You probably shouldn't be taking a random thing from external.
Well, it wouldn't be random, but I mean, you would totally, I would totally expect people to author to have it
Here's
because
the big
otherwise,
scenario.
think about how things compose, right? Let's say I'm the Azure library, and let's say the storage depends on some other thing, right? Azure Foobar, right?
Yeah.
And Azure Foobar has converters for their types. Azure Storage has converter for their types. Well, the layer that actually serializes both has to register both of them, right? So like, I mean, yeah, you would not, like Rando Joe would not create another Rando thing and then just throw it in there. But logically speaking, like if you're the author of the type and you're the author of the serialization handler, it makes perfect sense for me to register your converter for your types.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or your dependencies.
Yeah. Because otherwise, otherwise that means anybody who serializes always has to author everything, which is defeating the point, right?
I think a good scenario for that would be some users, a lot of users, like the JSON.NET semantics of trying to guess when we're deserializing things like ints and longs and decimals. Basically, they want it to be either deserialized as a number or a string. Today, we don't do that. We only support a number in JSON. So I assume pretty quickly somebody's going to create a bunch of converters or one big converter that knows how to do that, and it'll probably be shared.
Right.
And people probably use that quite often.
Yeah, looking at the design, I mean, like I've not looked at code yet, but it looks much cleaner than what we looked at last time. So my only question is if you scroll down a little bit to the actual converter type. So last time we talked a little bit about the concerns with structs. And I think some suggestion was to take them as ref.
Yeah, so since I switched not having an alt parameter, just return that, it will, of course, just return the T right now. But
right.
I don't know if we're going to gain anything by in a normal struct scenario.
Yeah, I think if that's a perf concern for the read here, then you could do that as a JIT optimization where it doesn't do a copy for the output buffer, and for the input one, that one's a bit harder because the ABI says you have to shadow copy the input if it's too big.
Yeah, the only thing I'm trying to get is like given that this is the only extension point we have, if it is a perf concern with library author, there's nothing they can do. Like there's no fallback for, just deal with the reader yourself and with the instance, because that's the only way you can actually get to the instance is by basically deriving from this thing. So you already get the T.
So what is the concern with structs in this?
So the idea, I think, I don't know, I forgot who brought it up,
Yeah.
but in the very first release that we talked about this, somebody said, what if I'm using a struct and the struct is large?
Okay.
Because basically when you call write,
Yeah.
they basically copy the struct over, right?
But how large realistically are these structs going to be?
See, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, like, I mean, it seems like there was a concern. I mean, I'm okay with deliberately saying we thought about it. We don't think it's a concern, so you're screwed.
I mean,
I think it's a valid
the idea
design
of
point.
structs as a best practice is that they shouldn't be large.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you say that, but once you get into ML, you're going to have like things like matrices, which are potentially large structs. Even in the common case of just like graphics, you have a matrix 4x4, which is 16 floats stored in a struct, and you're not going to want to incur the cost of the copy every time.
I mean, copying.
The only thing that can really fix that is exposing both write and write that takes a ref T, and then
Either ref T or in, right?
You'd
Would
want it
in
to
solve
be
the
in,
same
yeah.
problem?
yeah.
I mean, in has other problems right now where if the struct is not large, now you make it twice as expensive to get 4 bytes across the method.
I mean,
buffer,
that's ref in general.
right.
And that's net standard, right? The in modifier now.
That's
I think
that's C# 7.3, so technically it's framework as well.
I don't even think how is in represented at the metadata level. It doesn't require custom
So
attribute, right?
ref, out, and in are all under the covers a managed by reference, which are all the same type, which is why you can't overload between them. And then the C# compiler emits a additional attribute, namely out and in, which are the system runtime interop services attributes to do the differentiation.
And so basically, in is just read only out. Sorry, read only.
Yeah,
in?
in is a byref that has the in attribute and an additional read-only attribute. And then out is a byref that has the out attribute.
Are any of the attributes new, or are they?
No, the read-only one is new, but it's one of the magic attributes that the compiler emits if it can't find it in the
I see.
framework.
So technically speaking, this works everywhere.
Yeah,
Yeah, and in and out have been there since like .NET 1.0.
Yeah.
yeah, and since it's 7.3, it's supported on full framework
What
officially.
do we lose if we were to make this an in?
It just makes it harder to consume.
Yeah, if
So
you're
if-
serializing a ref or if you're serializing something that's a class
Yeah.
or reference type, you
Yeah.
have a double indirection on lookup.
Yeah.
Rather than a single indirection.
And
Or
that's
if the struct
probably
is
the
small,
common
right?
case.
If the struct is 4 bytes, now you're calling it with 8 bytes.
Yeah, but I would be surprised if somebody's using a small struct for this type of custom converter. Like, what would be a scenario?
No, he's saying like it's for every t, right? So if you pass in a string, you pass in a pointer to a pointer to the actual data.
Yeah, I get the class case, but
Yeah.
why would you ever want to pass in a small struct for serialization?
Actually, Tanner gave a good example of that earlier, where you want to custom serialize, I think, float and double to support not a number.
Yeah.
So you would just wrap it in a struct.
No, like you have a JSON
Oh,
converter
okay, I
of
see.
float
Ah,
of double.
yeah. I
Yeah.
see.
Yeah.
Okay, just to clarify though, on read, you are constructing it, so there's no.
Yeah,
having
read's
out
not a problem.
example doesn't help. Okay, so we're just talking about adding an in modifier
Yeah.
to the t value for write.
Which seems largely having other problems. So
Yeah.
I think we talked about this in other cases where we know structs are kind of largest, and even there was a lot of contention whether that actually makes things better or worse.
Yeah,
Ah.
it's really like unless you've got an abnormally large struct, which you really shouldn't have anyways,
Yeah.
then you're probably not going to hit this.
But you can work around it too by in your example, like you had you were working with ML data, like matrices, graphics, stuff like that. You could work around that by having a JSON converter of containing object, and then inside of that, just serialize everything very efficiently.
Yeah.
Assuming the containing object is a class, which I would hope it would be.
Right. You still have the cost of copying the data into the class, potentially.
Well, I assume that's where the data would just live normally.
I
You
mean,
could have a struct with an object, a box, but you could
Yeah.
also, get around the copy that way.
Well, I mean,
Right.
if you're boxing, you're incurring the cost of a copy anyways, in which case it's no worse than
Yeah.
just calling the method.
I mean, if you talk about perf in the JSON library, we mostly care about allocations, I think, because given that you're about to send pull data over the wire, I'm not sure that copies of like 8 to 20 bytes will actually show up. Like,
Also, aren't there other costs involved here? Like if I made this in T, in the matrix case, if this was in of a matrix of 16 floats, the implementation either needs to copy all of those to local registers, whatever, or every access to every field is going to be an indirection. That's unoptimizable.
I mean, you have that for a regular class anyway, don't you? Every access to a field is effectively an indirection through this pointer.
Right, but if we're talking about structs, we're talking about a trade-off between
Yes.
just having it on the stack versus adding all those indirections.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Right, but if it's only serializing properties, I don't think you can take ref property unless the property was itself ref returning. So once we say it's not doing fields, then this is mostly moot.
You
But
have
it's-
to make a copy.
The fact that it's not doing fields is just a current limitation. It's not something we would say.
No, but what Jeremy's saying is the actual implementation is going to have to be the caller makes a copy of the data before invoking the right method.
Yeah.
Because there's no field to access, there's nothing to get a ref to. You have to call the property getter, make a copy of it into a local,
actually
and
really
then pass a
good
ref to the
point.
local.
Nice.
in the vast majority of cases, you will have properties.
Yeah, and
Even if we allow fields
Yeah.
long term, probably the vast majority of payloads will not be fields.
And then the JSON library would have to do checks for like if this is a ref returning property and things like that, which are probably going to be more expensive than the copy anyways.
Right.
So
It is possible to add another type of converter to deal with this. I mean, the framework could just switch on the different types of converters, and I think, like I said earlier, we would have. If I want to create a different type of converter for things like collections and POCO types, just basically expose whatever the framework does in the future, not for this release. So, I mean, if we think this is fine for V1, but there's an optimization. And we don't want to add the in modifier because it causes other problems, right? That's what I'm hearing.
Right.
Then, we could add another converter in the future, or maybe we can add another write method here, and the framework could try to figure out which one to call.
I think your trade-off is fine. Just add it in the future. Once we receive feedback, hey, this is a shape I'd like it to have. Because right now we're just kind of speculating as to what people might need, and it's not going to be a breaking change to introduce a new way of doing this in the future, and let folks like the Azure SDK team figure out which one to use for their own optimization.
Okay, I'm good with that. So if I don't hear anything else, since you're on the screen, one of the things I wanted input on, and Aspen was talking to me right before this here, are these 4 exceptions, because we went away from the try read that returns a bool to have the converter itself throw exceptions, which are going to be caught, and then throw in as a nice JSON exception, saying something like unable to convert value. Here's the path, and the reader position and all of that. And I have 4 exceptions here. 2 of them are obvious, I think. One is format exception. The reader throws this quite a bit, and it's just a convenient exception to throw when the JSON's not what you expect. Overflow exception is common when calling parse. We don't really do this internally, maybe for the enum converter, but if somebody's doing an int converter and they call parse instead of try parse, then this will be thrown. The other 2 I think are debatable whether this is a mistake on the user side and it should be caught or not. But I'm definitely open here for we should discuss these.
So who's throwing argument exception?
I believe invalid argument and all of those. The reader can throw in certain cases if you misuse it, but that's usually a misuse case.
So it's usually I mean, I've seen the writer throw it. I mean, the writer does throw it. I don't know why a reader would throw it.
I mean, like argument exception is a usage problem, so that you should not intercept. Just let that leak. It's their bug. Format exception is they called get GUID and it wasn't a GUID. Invalid operation exception is they called get GUID and it wasn't a string. And I don't know why we would ever want overflow exception either. Like these seem like they're just customer bugs.
Overflow exception will be something like, I think, math.abs, and then you pass in 32 min value.
Or it's int32.parse, somebody trying to write a custom int converter.
So,
and that's
Yeah, but they could also do try parse in that case.
Yeah, I mean that's.
Well, no. I mean, it goes back to the same argument we did before. People might not use the try methods, and
I mean, the format exception is only because the reader has a get GUID method that can throw format exception. The reader can't ever throw overflow exception. At least I'm pretty sure.
right. So the question is, do we only catch exceptions with the reader and writer throw?
Yes.
Or should we do the additional things like argument exception or overflow exception that is meant for more general purpose people who implement converters?
I mean,
Like
they
in
have
Steve's
to
scenario,
get the data
enum
from the
converter.
reader, right? They're not getting the data by manually extracting bytes from the reader, right?
Right. But you could argue like his point, Steve's point is more like, so I am not using a reader API. I'm just using I'm using an enum converter. I'm writing an enum converter, and I call the frameworks in.parse on reader.valueSpec. In.parse does throw overflow exception, even though this is not an exception coming from the reader.
But why would you not just say reader get in effectively and then use that to determine what to do?
So one example is if you wanted to support strings, like a quoted integer.
We don't read numeric strings. We only read JSON numbers.
Well, why can't the reader just do if token type is string, try parse?
We've said we don't want to do that.
We don't do that today.
We don't coerce the type.
No,
So
I'm
this
saying
is,
the
quote
user
a
writing
custom
the
converter, right? I mean, So Aspen said, do we only worry about exceptions we throw internally, or we want to try to help the user out in some common scenarios for their
To
own?
me, the thing that we should make sure, because I think the most common thing is you're composing your stuff over the reader, right? So like I think if I call methods on the reader, that should just propagate. Anything I do custom, I would be okay if the user has to do code, because that's kind of sensible. You don't expect like in.parse to propagate as a JSON exception, right? Because clearly it's not a JSON API, right? But if I call things of the reader, it seems very weird that we would call catch the exception and wrap that in a JSON reader exception. That's I think that kind of makes sense, right? So argument exception, I would generally agree with Jeremy. Like your code is buggy. Like there's nothing that it's not a problem in the payload. It's the way you wrote your converter, right? Embedded operation was the thing that was unfortunate based on the way our reader works, but I think for argument exception we should definitely not catch.
So to clarify, format exception and invalid operation exception are the 2 exceptions that the reader does throw.
So which one?
Format and invalid.
Okay, so definitely catch
So
those.
we'll catch
then-
those for sure.
Okay.
Now on the reader case, is the argument and overflow falls in the camp of hey, let's not do it
Right.
because we only want to do
So,
except for the reader.
right, so like this is sort of comes down to what's the code you have to write, and I think that if somebody is just that they're doing, you know, they're doing this because they need custom logic on reading the property names, or they have weird stuff that a previous value is going to influence a future result on the same payload, like they have a prefix and now they're gluing it together. If they just call reader APIs,
Yeah.
it seems sensible to say they don't need a custom try-catch. And that it will be, oh, you did JSON-y stuff, this is a JSON-y exception. The moment that they write their own code to handle things, they have to turn it into a JSON exception. So try, catch, rethrows JSON exception. If they want everything out of their converter to look the same, they can write that. It goes against guidelines to catch all exception types, but they can do the normalization. And so it just comes down to there's easy converters and then there's hard converters, and it's just like everything else that we ever have in the framework.
Yeah.
Easy ways are really easy, and hard ways are uglier.
So, this is a hypothetical, but what happens if in the future the reader adds APIs or exception types that are not covered in this list?
Would have to be added.
So the guidance is, or the documentation would be, the read only catches exceptions that the reader throws, whatever they end up maybe being.
But it kind of points to the problem. Like I find it kind of unfortunate that the reader throws phone exception while operation exception. It makes sense if you only consider the reader in its isolation, but it falls apart when you consider the reader being a building block for other JSON.
So the other option, which is weird because now it changes the code that someone would write here, is we have an internal value on the reader that changes it from throwing invalid operation exception to just throwing JSON exception. That the serializer puts it in that mode before passing it back in these callbacks.
It doesn't even have to be internal. You could actually make that a public.
You could make it public.
Because I mean, it basically would be the IUUs inside of a JSON-y parsey thingy, right?
So we could say that we're going to change what the reader does, or what the reader throws if we're inside the serializer.
Would you consider just making the reader always throw a JSON exception and not any of these four?
So if you're using the reader, invalid operation exception is the right exception to throw.
Yeah.
So the only time it makes sense to change what it's throwing is when it's being used inside some other component.
I mean, we could always fudge that though to make scenarios more usable by people. It's just guidance, right?
I'm just the right exception for you have called this method, and this is not a method you can call given the state of the subject. Is
I'm in favor. Yeah,
So
I'm in favor of the.
another thing you can do is when you're any exception that's thrown by the JSON reader, there is a property bag on the exception object. You can always shove a value in there saying this exception was thrown by the reader. And the JSON serializer can catch all exceptions, inspect that, and if it doesn't see it, just rethrow. Otherwise wrap.
Maybe that's better.
That way you don't have to special case any of these types.
Actually, that's a really clean design because it also means you don't need magic format exceptions thrown by other code that happens to also fall.
It means any code that literally just throws one of these four or any other exception does not get swallowed by the serializer.
I see. So yeah.
Actually, I like that because then it also means you just have a singular exception filter for all exceptions. You just say filter is the JSON source thingy set in the dictionary, and then you just keep that. Otherwise, you just
Where's this bucket?
Exception.data, I think.
yeah exception.data.
Oh.
But yeah, it's just a property bag.
I mean, that would actually be. I think
the
you're
base type
right.
exception.
Exception public virtual iDictionary data. So
Yep. You could just
since that
literally
affects
throw.
two.
Yeah. I think it might.
Well, I mean, that is used during deserialization, right? The binary part.
Sorry.
Oh, I mean, that's the same property bag that's used during serialization and deserialization of exceptions.
Yep. Absolutely.
Are we allowed to put metadata like this in here?
Yeah, that's what it's there for.
Yeah,
That's why it's public.
you could shove a JSON reader exception equal true in that, and then yes, this could do a catch exception where or when e.data.try get value JSON reader exception.
Ideally, the data. So data is just iDictionary, but
Yeah, yeah.
ideally the key is a string and the value is a primitive. So int string,
I see.
whatever you want. Ideally.
So one of the issues today is that the path property on JSON exception, the JSON path, very handy when debugging, is not available on the reader today for performance reasons, and the serializer calculates it instead.
Okay.
That wouldn't be available to the user trying to throw their own exception. If we just let it,
No, but if you document that if they assert, JSON exception true in the data property of any exception that's being thrown, that it will rewrap it in a JSON serialization exception.
Well, they could also just throw a JSON exception and read the current marker off the reader, right? That information's there.
No,
Not the path
it
information.
doesn't know what. It knows what the token is. It doesn't know how it got there.
Got it. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, they could, presumably you're already catching the other JSON reader exception. So if they just threw an empty one, you'd build the path on top of it. That's another option they have.
So we could just special case JSON exception then, or similar.
But I mean, once we're doing this metadata thing, we should just put it in the API or put it in the docs.
Right. So actually, that sort of
Then it'll rewrap anything that has that attribute on the data property.
that also sort of resolves my previous other concern that I had, which is even though the read and the reader will never throw argument exception, the write and therefore the writer does throw argument exception. So if you wanted to just have a list of exceptions that we catch, then there's a difference between the list that read.
But argument
catches.
exception is a usage error.
Yeah.
So you could have, let's say, a POCO
Yeah.
that has a string property that happens to be more than 100 megabytes. The writer throws argument exception. So it's not really
Gotcha.
Why is that an argument exception?
Because your argument is the thing it can't support.
because you're passing a string that is too large to a JSON writer API.
How would the caller know that up front?
That the string is too large.
The string is too large.
Yeah.
Right. I think right now it's just documentation.
It's
isn't it?
documentation.
Because the general guidelines, you should not throw argument validation for things that you cannot statically determine whether that's correct behavior or not.
You can statically
You can
determine it by
write
reading the
to the
docs.
Well, no, but how would I write code? Like how would I change my code to handle that case?
If string length is greater than what the doc told me the maximum size was. Wow.
Sure,
I mean,
that's what I'm
no
saying.
one's going to be passing strings of several hundred megabytes.
But that's what I'm
on
saying.
these
So, like, if we
APIs.
expose the constant as a public API or something, right? Or like, I mean, then in that case, I can actually write the code, right? In which case, it would be okay. But
Yeah.
you could easily imagine with embedded operation exception in that case, right? It's the same. Like, it's basically a dynamic property of the thing you're stating in, right?
I see.
Like, argument exception is usually for cases where, you pass in 3 ints and they have a certain relationship to each other that you violated or something, right?
Yeah.
But you're not. Like, this is not like the data is invalid or anything. Like, it's just like, I don't support gigabytes of data, right? But anyway, like, I mean, I think in general, like, by the way, we could also use exception.source because it also seems like it's exactly for that reason. It's just a string gets set.
Where the exception came from?
Well, it's. I think the default property is the type that throws it, populated by the runtime. I think. No, sorry, it's the assembly name of the call site usually, but you can totally create that and set that to wherever you want, and you could use that as well.
Sure.
That
So
also.
it's a UTF-8 JSON reader full name.
Yeah. And then you just compare that. And,
Catches exception when or where source is type of UTF-8 JSON reader full name.
seems reasonable.
So we have
It's like
options
that
on-
call stack sniffing thing that I said, but it doesn't involve call stack sniffing.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a built-in API that works rather than you have to do the custom stuff.
Yeah, I've never played with those properties on exception.
But I'm pretty sure they were added for more or less the same reason.
the target site should be correct, I think, for the exception.
Then what should be correct?
The target site, it's basically the method base it through the exception.
Yeah, but then you'd have to check. I mean, you could ask if the target site's declaring type is JSON reader, but then users. I mean, if we want to say we don't want users to also opt into it, that they
Yeah,
should
yeah,
just
yeah,
throw JSON
yeah.
exception.
But that seems
Yeah.
also dangerous because the question is now how do you construct the exception, right? Because it basically is reflective of where the throw statement occurred.
Oh,
Yeah.
And that
yeah.
might be some
and that's
build
always throw
return.
helper.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the case
the
of the
throw
JSON
helper would
reader
be in the
stuff.
right assembly.
No, but the if you ask method base, the throw will be throw helper, not throw invalid operation exception.
But the
Yeah.
assembly will be correct.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
If you wanted to do it coarsely at the assembly level.
which you would have to do due to things like inlining and such. Actually, exceptions don't get inlined, so that's okay.
I mean,
Anyway,
like the way you would do it
Yeah.
is you would say the throw helper sets the string to a very
Yeah,
known
okay.
thing, right?
So-
But you would not like because otherwise, as soon as you type forward that fucker down, at some point you just break a bunch of your code,
Yeah.
and it probably will take you forever to find that because well everything works until you realize that you eat too many exceptions, right?
Okay.
So if we change source or target site, I mean, are people going to get confused if they're used to the normal?
No, because I mean, logically, the way you would document is you would just say any exception that occurs from the reader we conveniently wrap, right?
Well, I'm just thinking of code that might do like a global try catch, I don't know, an ASP.NET, and then dumps it out, saying, hey, this is,
Oh,
you know.
well, I mean, sources, like if you look at framework exception at some point, I think I did an exception dialog or something where I dumped the source. The source in .NET is usually the assembly name, but there's many components that send it to a custom value. Like SQL does it, I think XML does it. It's basic diagnostic information for whoever cares about that string.
Is there a concern with us catching an exception that has this set and then rethrowing a JSON exception? And
You
now,
wouldn't rethrow. What you would do is you would have a catch under with a filter. You would say catch exception if exception.source equals magic string, and that means your catch ender will not execute if this thing is not.
Yeah, but once it is executed, what are you doing in the?
You
Catch
wrap
block?
it inside of a JSON exception,
Yeah.
then you rethrow it,
Yes.
I mean,
and that's what the ASP.NET team wanted.
And that would change the source to be now the serializer.
no, the outer exception would have a normal looking exception. The
Yeah.
inner exception that it's wrapping stays exactly the
Yeah.
same. It's just a
Yeah.
wrapped object.
Okay,
And-
but
and
the
then-
the source or the data property on the exception in the
You know-
exception case that would match the type that's through it. Right? In this case, JSON serializer.
No, it would be
No,
well,
the outer.
on the outer one.
The one that the serializer
Yeah.
said throw new
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
exception, comma, E.
Yeah.
The outer one would just be normal.
Okay.
It would be,
Okay.
Its source would say system text JSON.
But remember the
If
scenario.
I understand this 20 lines of reflection correctly.
The scenario for this was that the ASP.NET team needed the ability to basically catch a single exception type and say, I want this to be an HTTP 400 instead of an HTTP 500.
Yeah.
So the outermost try catch from within the serializer would do that normalization on their behalf.
Yeah, to me, the biggest concern with catching argument exception or invalid operation exception, I mean, format and overflow is kind of in the parsing area, so I don't care that much. But invalid operation and argument exception could be random bugs in your code, right? Where you read from a stream that you shouldn't have, or you call a method that you passed null to some API that didn't like the null thing, and suddenly like the serializer is eating exceptions, and you have no idea what's going on. And then like if you drill in, you find out, oh, there's a bug in my code.
I mean, I was a little wary of it too. But I like doing source filtering. The only place I've seen a framework that does it is the XApp launcher. Rewrite source. I think that they moved the type. And,
So the what? The X app?
app model XApp launcher. So I think that's
Never heard of that type.
it might be click once.
Oh yeah, that sounds about right.
And I think they moved the type out of system deployment. So when they throw it, they overwrite source to say system deployment, even though they're in presentation framework.
So somebody's handling that string.
So their own.
So someone
type
somewhere
filtering.
must be filtering on it.
Yeah.
I mean, SQL exception and ODBC exception also have overriding the source.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just looking for who wrote
Sets
through
it.
the source
Yeah.
property.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Because it's a publicly set.
Do we know what the trade-offs are between using source versus the data property then?
I think what we said earlier, right? I think source is just basically data on the instance versus the data back is meant for serialization, I think.
Well,
Okay.
is that something we need to determine here, though?
No, I'm
Yeah.
just curious.
Yeah,
It's not relevant. to
Yeah.
this.
So if we want to say that it will catch exceptions using a property of the exception instead of the type of the exception. That,
Okay, so can I reiterate, kind of taking notes here?
Sure.
Okay, so the reader writer will set exception source to some magic value, system text JSON or something like that, right? But only for those exceptions that we want to catch in the serializer. Is
Well,
that
yeah.
true?
Yes, I would generally say anything that the reader throws that you would expect the serializer to catch, you mark basically at the throw side.
Mhm.
And then everything else, like for example, argument exception, when somebody misuses the reader APIs, you just throw an argument exception without that because you would not expect the server to handle that. You would just expect to crash at that point.
Okay, and then the serializer will catch those and rethrows JSON exception, with the inner exception being
Yes.
whatever. And I think the third thing then is that the user code for converters need to make it easy to throw JSON exception. Today, there's basically one constructor, takes the string, the line number, path, and byte offset, whatever. But I think I need to add two overloads. One default with nothing, and the second one a string parameter like the message. And when thrown by the user, we would catch that and rethrow and add the path and line number and all of that. Does that sound reasonable?
If you rethrow, you're going to lose the original stack information.
Yeah, it'll be on the inner, I guess. But
So wrap.
So wrap rather than rethrow.
Yeah. So I think it would make sense to let someone create either you take the existing JSON exception or you just make a derived type off of the JSON exception that's easier to create, which is JSON conversion exception, and then that's only the only thing that ever touches that special would be the serializer.
Would we continue to the serializer continue to catch JSON, a special case JSON exception aside from the exception list that is filtered on the source?
So I was asking it.
So right now the JSON serializer special case is JSON exception and catches it, right? And then to do the rethrow.
Right.
And then it has this list of exceptions that we said, hey, you don't need to use this list of exception. Just do a catch all and get the exception dot source.
Yeah, filter by the
Filter by that. Would it continue to special case JSON exception?
Does
It
the
doesn't
reader actually throw JSON exception at all?
It's all JSON reader exception.
That's deriving from JSON exception.
This is what's the easiest thing that a user can write in their code to say that they want to throw an exception that says that serialization failed instead of their code failed.
yeah, I mean, you can scroll down just a tiny bit.
I see.
I mean, I have throw new format exception everywhere, and I'm assuming that would just be throw a new JSON exception. People, I don't think, aren't going to write.
The source setting thing. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fine.
No, I mean, like I would generally say, like whatever the outer exception is, right? We could just say we don't handle that. We just forward that. Like, why would we even wrap it?
Yeah.
Right, but the reason we want to wrap it is so you get the path context that the serializer has that the reader doesn't.
The serializer
I mean,
could.
you can still do that with exception dispatch info.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't even need to do that, I think. Like, if you see a JSON exception coming up, JSON exception presumably has a path property or something.
But they don't know how to set it.
No, the JSON serializer doesn't know how to set it?
The user throwing it wouldn't know, which is why I said maybe you want a derived type off of JSON exception, which is something like JSON conversion exception that doesn't take any of that data. They throw what went wrong in their conversion, and then that gets wrapped in the standard serialization exception, which puts the path on the outer exception.
Yeah, Stephen, are you suggesting that we use EDI to basically catch the exception, set the path property, and then rethrow with the original core stack?
You don't need EDI for that, though. You can literally just mutate the exception and throw.
I was simply responding to the concern that if you rethrow using like throw space exception semicolon, that you lose the original information. We have ways of working around that, but that was the concern.
But you don't need that anyway. Like, you can literally do throw semicolon and it will rethrow the original object, which you could have mutated inside the catch block.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't mutate the
I
string
see.
part.
Yeah, that's right. The only case where that doesn't work is within the same method.
Depends on how many internal sets it has.
Yeah.
I don't think you can mutate the message though.
Oh no, because that lives on
not the message,
bottom.
but the okay.
Yeah. So today we show the path as part of the message.
Well, we could override the message
Well,
to consume it lazily, right? In which case you implicitly can change it. But yeah,
Yes, you can override message.
so we could even change the message if we want. Could. I mean, wrapping is probably cleaner because it also means you always wrap. So
It's
Might
just
be good.
yeah. So then the question is, should it just be the existing JSON exception, or should it be a new derived
Yeah.
type, or whatever? I don't have strong feelings, but I do agree that it shouldn't require them to pass in
Yeah.
4 options that they don't understand
Yeah.
how to give.
I think a parameter-less constructor and one that just takes message is probably the easiest on just having on JSON exception. Probably have that anyway.
So what exception did we designate for this?
JSON exception?
JSON exception?
Yeah, it's an
My
existing.
prep is assuming we can mutate everything, the message, and not, lose the stack that, yeah, JSON exception, I think would be the normal,
Yeah.
except people would want to throw.
Reverse.
And,
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I like that. That seems very clean.
okay.
Any more questions? Because otherwise, I have a specific question.
I also have a specific question or comment.
So if you go back here, I'm still somewhat at loss how this attribute is supposed to work. So I guess the idea is I derive from this attribute, right? And then I override create converter if I want to have a special converter. What do I pass
You
to?
only have, okay, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. You only have to override this in a special case if you want to pass additional state to your converter. Otherwise, you can use this existing one and just specify in the constructor the converter type, and it'll automatically create the converter for you.
Right.
So it's only used to pass additional state.
Okay, so but my question still stands then. So let's say I do my immo JSON converter attribute that creates some special converter that needs some state. What do I pass to my base constructor?
You can search for this, and there's a sample.
Because it's
Presumably
the
it's the very next one.
It's the point converter attribute. Keep going. Yeah.
and so why would we like? It seems like you're not passing the converter type. You actually pass the type you're converting here. In which case, should we just offer a parameterless constructor that's protected? Because it seems like the converter property as well as the converter type property plus the type is meaningless when you extend the attribute, right? It's only useful if you don't extend the attribute and you just use it to basically have that guy work.
I think so. Look at the code. I think so.
Because otherwise you just pass in random types, which are not useful, right?
I mean, interestingly, in your example, you don't even use type to convert in the create converter method.
Presumably because he only put it on a sealed type,
Yeah.
so he didn't need to know what the specific type he was converting was.
In fact, this goes one step further. Should we also remove the property at that point?
Which property?
Converter type
Converter type.
on the attribute.
Because in which case, I
So
would-
you think you want JSON converter attribute and abstract JSON custom converter attribute?
no, I'm just suggesting this. I'm just suggesting something simple.
I mean, I think my feeling on that is if you're going to take a constructor or you specify the type, that you should just have a property that can return that.
Yeah, that's pretty typical.
I mean, you could leave the attribute and just say it's null. In that case, when you basically extend it.
It
Yeah.
is.
I mean, yeah, so it would just be, if
That
you
would
call the
also
default
work.
one, it's just the value is null. It's,
Yeah, that also works for me.
But if you were using, if you used reflection and you pulled one of these back, you can see like they instantiated specifically this type, and you're like, well, what value did they pass? I don't know that you can go back and recover what the literal in the IL was.
In reflection, you can, yes.
Okay.
It's called custom attribute data because that's what actually called the metadata, right?
You
But it's
can't
way
get
less
it-
convenient than just reading the property
Yeah.
off of the attribute.
Well,
type.
because you can't get it from the attribute instance, you have to go back to the declaration site and then call a different
Yes.
API to get it, which makes it
Yeah, so you'd
inconvenient.
say you call get custom attributes and be like, great, I got one of these. It's useless.
and now you can't
Now I have
inspect
to
it.
go do the
Yeah.
other.
Can
thing.
you clarify the need for the protected parameterless constructor?
Because what's the point in me setting it?
Because everyone who derives it in that way, the best answer for them to pass is null. So why make them pass a word? Because all it's doing is returning a type that it may not make sense. Like their create converter doesn't have to return the type that they returned or that was exposed on that property. So,
In
But
fact,
don't we need a type at all times? Like even in this example, you're calling the base converter with the type.
Yeah, but that's either the wrong type, right? Because basically what you normally pass is the type of the converter, which in your case is
Not the type of the convertee.
yes.
It helps the framer create the
Right.
type if you don't override create converter.
Like in fact, if you don't, if your state is something you can compute,
Yeah.
you can actually get away with, in this sample to delete the entire constructor, because basically we will automatically now invoke the base constructor that is protected,
Yeah.
which doesn't get any state.
Yeah.
So the only reason why you will have your own constructor is if you need state yourself, and then you just emit the entire base call.
Don't you at some point need though to get the type that you're trying to convert to?
You get that
That's
from
what
create
you
converter.
get passed there, right?
It will return null if it can't do it.
Right. So let's say we don't have the type. We have a parameterless constructor on the attribute.
Sure.
What does the code look like for create converter?
Exactly like this.
Exactly like this, because
So
you
where
don't
does-
need this type here, right?
So where does type of point come? Okay.
So this type of point never mattered. No one ever read the value that went there
Yes.
in this code right now.
I think the serializer does to determine if
Now, would you be using where this attribute, the type that this point converter attribute was on?
You'll see it's defined on a property. The attribute usage is property, not type.
okay, so create converter would be changed to be if type to convert equals type of point.
Yes.
Okay.
So right now it just ignores that value because the person who wrote it knows that they only applied it on a thing that was returning a type
I
of
see.
point.
Yeah.
The value they passed to the base class was
Yeah.
ignored because presumably it's the default value of the base create
Yeah.
converter method is return this attribute
So
value.
the only value for this type to convert parameter would be for validation that the property at which you put it on matches this.
And not just validation. There's also an example later in this document for doing list of T.
Yeah, you did a generic. You didn't know
Yeah.
what T was when it was
Yeah.
applied.
Which,
Okay.
by the way, like later in this meeting, I want to poke at that a little bit. But
Or if you support multiple types, right? I mean, you could imagine that point converter doesn't just handle point, but also handles
Point
size,
2,
point 2, point 3, right? You just have one attribute that does them all.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense.
I mean,
So then in that case, why do we need the constructor that takes?
if you don't derive, if we just want to point to the actual converter,
Yeah, that's send this value to that converter type. I don't have any extra data to
Okay,
give to
okay,
it.
okay,
Instantiate
gotcha.
it and tell it that it's building a me,
Yes. Okay.
which it gets from the generic, right? I think.
And so the default implementation of converter attribute will implement create converter as create activator instance.
well, it would have to check to see if you called the parameterless constructor, and if so, throw, saying you need to override
Well,
me too.
I mean, presumably it's just return activator.create instance the property, and if you put null there, then activator create instance yells at you.
Well, so
watch it.
so now we have an issue, right? Where if you're subclassing JSON converter attribute, you really need to override a method that's not marked abstract, and now we have problems.
No, you don't. If you don't overwrite it, it uses whatever the property says.
Which can be null.
It could be null if you wrote it literally too.
Right, so you're
Once it-
basically expected to either pass in the type in the constructor, or you're expected to
Yeah.
have overridden.
Yeah.
And if you don't do either of those, then you may blow up at runtime if it ever gets invoked.
And again, you will find out the first time you hit
First,
F5.
yes.
Okay. Yeah. So part of I guess I was a little confused because we have a parameter called converter type, and then on create converter we have the type to convert,
Yes.
Yeah.
which are two different things.
Yes.
There are
Or
two colors.
convertee.
Is there? Maybe you can rename the parameter better. I think convert type to convert makes sense.
yeah.
Out loud, but yeah.
I mean, the only thing you could do is
We
when
can
the,
have two attributes. No.
sorry, come again, Steve.
You can have two attributes or derived attribute. Make it a little clearer.
I think one attribute is fine because it seems like a very somewhat advanced scenario. Like, I think the best we could do if we really want to help those people that need to extend this attribute is to say, in the virtual method, we just check whether converter type is null and then throw a better exception and just letting the thing
Sure.
out ref and say,
Yeah.
embedded operation exception, you must set a converter type or something, right? I mean,
But-
you didn't tell me what to do. Either override me or tell me what to do, right?
But I'm okay with
Yeah. And,
convoluted API that like you obviously it tells you the first time you tried to use it that you used it
Right.
wrong. I don't like there's not a delayed usability. This isn't a rare code path. This is the first time you tried using it. It told you no, you did it wrong.
So one comment I had around the attributes, maybe Steve, you want to talk to that, is the precedence ordering. I don't think we covered that,
Yeah,
but
okay,
effectively.
before we talk about that,
Yeah.
I mean, basically we're saying we don't need the constructor, parameter, right?
No, I think we decided we'll keep.
There would be a protected parameterless
Yeah.
constructor,
Yeah, we would add a protected constructor that's.
and the public constructor would still take the type.
Yeah.
Because that's the common usage.
And the protected constructor wouldn't have any arguments.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay, so yeah, scroll to the very bottom of this document. I talk about that issue that Aston mentioned.
Which one is that?
Very, very bottom. Just hit Control N.
Oh, it's literally the end of the thread.
Yeah, sorry.
No, of the
No,
original post.
within that section, it says the ordering semantics.
Oh, you mean actually? Okay, so you meant in the doc.
I thought you had some.
Going.
Okay,
Here we
I'll
go.
just let you.
Approach take here is have a separate type. I'm reading the wrong section. Okay, now it makes more sense.
This seems reasonable.
So, Aston asked about the ordering. I mean, I tried to document that a little bit in the comments of the attribute. But basically, if you put the JSON converter attribute on a property, a POCO, a property of a POCO object, it's always going to be used. Okay. The next thing that will be used is the any kind of runtime converter you added,
Right.
which will override any kind of static attribute you put on a type. So for example, if somebody has a cool phone number type and they put the attribute on it to say, here's my converter, and you don't like that converter, you can still override it through the add mechanism.
I think that makes sense too. Yeah.
That would be consistent with how kind of the framework in a way does it. Of course, we don't add an attribute to integers or whatever, but you can still override the default. And then the last one, of course, is if you have no converter specified anywhere, you fall back to whatever the framework is.
Yeah, this seems reasonable.
I
So
think that's the
one thing just to clarify, like clarifying question, you put attribute on the property first, then you put the runtime registration, and then you put attribute on the type.
right.
Wouldn't it be property type then runtime registration?
No, because think of it, right? Like the question is like, what is more localized,
Yeah.
right? So the first one is more localized in the static hierarchy,
Yeah.
right? Because on the property, not on the type,
Yeah.
right? That makes sense.
Yeah.
But putting something on the type means this is global for the entire program, right?
Yeah.
Versus doing it in the registration and serialization option is just global within your serialization session,
Yeah.
right? So the serialization options is more localized than the type registration is.
So now,
In that case, I think to your point,
Yeah.
because you can't register converters on properties on the serialization options, that's why this interleaved thing happens, right? I think if serialization options would give us a way to say on this type, this property has this converter, it would probably come after the like in between the first two, right? Same by the same logic.
but a property has a type that's returning. I thought that's the type that would get mapped.
Yeah, but that is
Converter.
less specific than the type is, right? Sorry, it's more specific than the type. But the property is the instance in which you use the type, which is more localized than the type as a whole.
Should there be another in this precedence hierarchy after the JSON converter attribute on the POCO, which is JSON runtime registration on the POCO?
On the actual instance?
Yeah.
I don't think we have the ability to register converter for an instance.
Why
Let's-
would you want to do that, though? Because if you wanted to register the converter on the instance, literally just new up the converter and pass it in. Like, skip the serializer entirely.
So let's say you had. Oh, I see what you're saying. So I was saying like if you had a complex object graph, like you have a type within another type.
Yeah.
These are all both types are user defined. The nested type, or not the nested, the one that has a property.
Mhm.
If we add an converter attribute on it, saying I want to use converter foo,
That will get honored over any registration that you make at the
yeah.
call site.
But now, what if I want to register the attribute, that converter, rather than putting it on an attribute?
I think you would register the converter for the outer type at that point. Because you're doing something other than what the type author intended.
Yeah.
And there's probably more that you need to do rather than just change how that one inner piece of data is serialized.
Okay.
I'm speculating,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, because I mean, it seems a bit weird to do that at the instance level.
yeah, because you're suggesting what if, like, why shouldn't the registration itself override what's declared on the property?
So you have one attribute on the property. This
Yeah.
is the converter attribute, and you can register it as well instead, right? Or register.
Yeah.
Right. This is a get set. You can also put an attribute on the type itself, like class food. What if I want to register for food? Where does that go in the hierarchy? Like in this case, you have an attribute or registration, right? For, like I have a property that's string. I want to do string converter.
Well, that's the third item in the list, right?
So that's the attribute. What about
Yeah.
registration? I want to register a converter for food. What's the ordering for that?
I think a better example is you have an order. An order has an address as a property.
Yeah.
How do you register a converter for address if what you're serializing is an order?
Yeah, I think that is the converters.add because when you add the converter, you're registering it for a type, but the sheer fact that the converter says can convert type foo, right? Return true. Like you don't specify the type, but given that basically we ask the converter, can you handle foo? The answer is yes. So your global registration is always for whatever types that converter supports, right?
But then that global registration can be overridden by an attribute I put on order.
Well, you can
No.
only override it in the context of a property, not in the context of a type.
Yeah, so
So then what is the third bullet saying?
So the third bullet is saying that if you apply a JSON converter to the type, if you actually have an attribute on foo, that means you don't have to basically put the registration in.
But
But if you
had
do put
a
a registration, then that takes precedence of whatever you put on that attribute. Yes.
Yeah.
Because it's more scope, that it's scoped to utilization session rather than to the entire program.
Okay.
Because the attribute will count in any serialization session, right?
So the registration attribute, but then the registration beats attributes on a property, but doesn't beat attributes on a type.
Well, because I think that's just because, as I said earlier, right, that's just an artifact of the fact that you cannot register converters for a property, right? There's no API for that.
Okay.
If there would be such an API,
Okay.
I think that API would take precedent, would be basically the very first item in the list.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I mean, if everything being equal, runtime registration has priority over design time. So.
Okay. All right.
Which is the second and third bullets.
That once you've actually delved into a type, anything once you've actually said, once you've made the decision to start serializing a type as the type itself is laid out, at that point you start trusting the annotations on the type's properties.
Okay.
You trust that it's doing the correct thing for itself.
Right.
So I think this is primarily implementation details, so it doesn't affect the API surface. So I think I'm okay with this. I just recall James mentioning his converter model that went property, class, then global converters, global registered converters, and this one is just is different from that.
So basically, you would swap the second and third.
If you were to do that, I mean, then basically when you put the custom data type, I mean, when you put the attribute, on your custom data type or POCL, you can never override it, right? At runtime.
Yeah.
So
I see.
it wouldn't be. And why would you register it at runtime if it doesn't do anything?
Yeah, but I just like the whole property example. I thought that the runtime registration.
Because it's specific to a property, you like global.
I think in general, when you look at this from a customer type, right? I mean, there's two kinds of customers, right? There's the one that don't want to deal with converters on the registration at all. They will just put the attributes on their DTOs because they're designed for JSON serializing, right? They would never put shit on properties either, right? They would just put them on the types because you would just say, my address type is going to be serialized everywhere the same. Like, why would I differ whether it's on the person or whether it's on an organization? It's just the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Then there's a second class of customers who generally doesn't want to do anything on their types. They just want to put everything on the registration because they don't want to pollute their types, which is kind of where Christoph's coming from, right? And then there's the kind of in between where, let's say Levi authors the address type, and I'm using that in the Azure SDK, but I don't like how his converter works, right? And his converter is on the type level, so I'm like, no, fuck it, I override this thing in the Azure SDK, and I serialize it differently, right? That's why you generally want runtime registration to win, because it's the only way I have to customize somebody else's type. Like if somebody else already designed the type to be serializable, I'm stuck with their behavior otherwise.
Yeah.
Now it is true though. Like if you put things on his properties, I'm fucked.
Yeah, this is what I was saying. Like
That's the only
global
unfortunate thing.
But that again implies that you trusted my type to serialize itself correctly.
Yes.
And if you trusted my type to serialize itself correctly, hopefully you also trust the annotations I put on my own properties.
Well, it's less about trust. It's just like, do I like what it looks like, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm using the word trust nebulously
Yeah.
here, but yeah.
Because I think that's the only case where you would override somebody else's.
But if you did not like it on the type, then why are you okay with it on the property? Then move.
But you're not. That's the thing.
I'm not. I'm just asserting that almost nobody puts it on a property.
I see. Okay.
But if you change the registration for an entire type, you're not picking up the annotations on the properties anyway because you've written your own converter.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
you're
So
responsible
you
for the
could-
entire stack at that point.
Hmm.
Because putting an annotation on the type is also a way to override the annotation or the declarations on the properties.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
just
so
a
it's-
different type, right? So, for
Yeah.
example, let's say we have person, organization, and address, right?
Yeah.
I can convert an address, but if you, for whatever reason, put a property on the address property on the type on organization and person,
Yeah.
I also now have to register basically a converter for a person and organization.
But why would I do that at the property? As the author of this class hierarchy, why would I do that at the property level instead of the type level, unless I really wanted to change how that one specific property went out?
Yeah.
So in that case, should the runtime registration be the first thing? Because clearly you can override even the property attributes on the property.
No, the point that I was making was actually an argument to keep it as is. And again, go back to the order example, right?
Okay.
Where you have like maybe you have a billing address and a shipping address,
Yeah.
or both typed as address.
Yeah.
Why would I put annotations on those two properties individually rather than just putting it on the address type? Like it's just more work for me. The only reason I would ever do it as the designer of that type is if I actually wanted to change how billing and shipping were serialized with regard to each other. And at that point, I'm now making a very localized decision within the structure of this type that this is how the data needs to look.
Yeah, but now the user who doesn't control the model
Yeah.
has no way to inject their own converter.
But that's okay because like I as the author of the type am explicitly saying if you the caller are already trusting me to
Yeah.
lay this out correctly on
Yeah,
the wire,
yeah.
this is how I'm dictating these other
Then that
things are
should
going
apply
to
to
be
the
laid
type
out.
level as well. Why only in property?
Not necessarily,
Okay.
because at the type level, what you're saying is I'm putting this out on the wire the way that address would do itself. Like I'm making from within the order class,
Yeah.
I'm making no statements as to how address should actually write itself out.
Okay.
Address is fully responsible for that. And in this case, you can change how address is responsible for
Yeah.
that. If the order type were instead to put annotations both on shipping address and billing address, those
Yeah.
properties, now the order type is saying I am very opinionated as to how these things are
Okay.
going to get written out.
So this distinction might be a bit more confusing, especially
Yeah.
if it disagrees with what Jason Rest's precedence hierarchy
Yeah.
is. I will leave it up to
Yeah, and I'm not,
James, you and
yeah, and
Steve.
I don't necessarily
I'll
mean
get
to
one
say
way or
that this is the one true answer. It's
Yeah.
just I can reason to myself that this totally makes sense.
My only worry is like either we should try to be consistent with Jason Rest's precedence hierarchy or
Yeah.
something that is more.
So what does JSON.NET do? Do they have registration per type and per property?
I believe so. Steve, do you know?
I don't think they have any property registration. You register a global converter similar
Yeah.
to this here. But I don't think they have anything special for property.
Yeah, and there's nothing stopping us in the future from being able to add converters for individual property infos as well, if we really decide that's a scenario we want to support.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple hierarchies. That's why it's confusing. There's runtime versus design time,
Yeah.
and then there's type property. So you lay those two on. You have a matrix. There's a missing thing here, which would be the first bullet. It says, at runtime, I need, for this particular property, this converter. That would actually be the first thing on here.
Yeah.
Does that? And anyway, yeah, So layer, yeah, static, or design time versus runtime, and then type versus property. And I think this is the fallout
Yeah.
from that. But maybe I'll put in here that other missing entry, say, future, possible future feature or something to make that matrix a little more clear.
Cool.
I had a question
question.
about your list of T converter. So you have an example in this document for how you can write, using a single converter, something that can handle both list of int and list of long. How do I also extend that to support literally list of T, where I don't know the T at compile time? T could be person, T could be itself list of int, and so on. Like how does that actually look?
Well, ultimately, you have to know or have some default logic to handle everything, right? Because you have to serialize or deserialize.
Well, not necessarily, because if the serializer itself already knows how to serialize person through some mechanism, and I know how to serialize list of T, how do I compose my stuff on top of the serializer's existing knowledge on how to work with person?
You can delegate by calling the serializer again with your type. So you could do it that way. You can call back in the serializer.
Okay.
In theory, if we had a nice model here, which I don't think I'll have time to, you'd be able to say, give me the converter for customer or person, whatever, and I'll just return the default one if there's not one. Today, the default one is not exposed. You'd get null back. And then you could call read or write directly on that converter as well.
Okay.
As an alternative to calling the JSON serializer static methods.
Okay, so even if we don't add APIs for the scenario, I think having documentation for what it might look like to write such a converter would be really useful. Because like I said, in this document, we already have examples of how to do list of int and list of long. I would just like to see that extended to support list of T, literally of T.
Any open generic.
Yeah, any open generic.
Well, I mean, in the end, it gets closed, right, and calls your method.
It does, but what does it look like for me as a person writing a list of T converter? What does
I can
that look
provide
like?
the sample once I check the code in.
Okay.
To the key value pair
Mhm.
type, it's going to be key value pair key value. Of course, those can vary, and the converter itself won't have any specific knowledge of those.
Sure.
So I can point to that one. That might be a better example than list, because it's also more complicated because you have two generic values.
Okay.
So it's kind of cool that we can support more than one generic value with this model.
Yeah, and I think the reason I mention this is because I think there are going to be some power users who want to do something like this, and having samples would go some way toward fulfilling that.
Okay, I have one more item I wanted some feedback on. If you want to scroll up to the yeah, okay, thanks for that feedback. Yeah, I'll do that. Let me see, at the very top in the API section, I added a method based on some feedback for get converter options. So it has a list of converters here, and if you scroll down just a hair, it should say get converter. I added this based on feedback. I can explain. I mean, it might be useful if you're implementing converter, say, hey, give me the default enum converter, instead of having to call back into the framework, JSON serializer parse or something. You can just do it more efficiently by getting the converter and doing it that way. However, if this could actually be another helper method on a custom collection. Right now, it's iList of JSON converter on the converters property. So we could make a custom collection and have that method on there. That's one alternative. But the main thing that kind of came up in the implementation of this is that this method exists internally already, and it's called quite a bit by the framework. But it assumes that once it calls it, it gets the proper converter given the whole list of converters and then caches it. So if somebody calls this not during deserialization or serialization, but before that, I'm not sure what to do. I mean, if we cache it at that point, we'd have to throw it away, when the first deserialization occurred, because it could change.
Right.
I could throw in valid operation, document it saying, hey, don't call unless you're calling from a converter.
So why do we need it to be public?
We don't need to. It was just based upon feedback that said, hey, you know, how do I get a converter from within a converter to help instead of having to do the reentry on the JSON serializer, which has problems like losing path, for example, and plus it's slower.
So I can see a scenario where I would like to instantiate my own converter passing in the existing converter. So in this case, I would not be able to do that before. Like I couldn't do it after serialization has started, right? I would have to do that effectively up front.
Yeah, so we get allowed. I just have to do the right thing internally to say, okay, you can call get converter all you want. You add a converter. You call get converter again. You might get a different result back. You know, I just need to discuss that with somebody before I spend the time implementing that.
Probably what I would do is I would say, get converter, like the API you have here never caches unless there's an internal method that you call when serialization starts. That's like say snapshot or something. And after that point, like you can no longer modify converters, and that's also when you start caching. Before that, you don't cache.
Okay, as long as everyone's okay with this, I can get it to work like that.
So just to understand better, is get converter effectively just looking at your list of JSON converters and finding the first one that matches?
Yep, and then also if you pass in a type that needs to go through the factory, it'll do that for you.
And what would the user do?
Pass in list of customer, and somebody implements list of T, it'll return the proper one for you.
And what should the user do once they have called get converter? Now that I have a JSON converter, what do I do with it?
Well, I think the main scenario that I thought, if you're in the implementation of your own converter, and you just need to convert a property that you don't know how to convert yourself, maybe for whatever reason, okay, and you want to do that efficiently. This is how you do that. The other scenario is, maybe you want to inspect the list of converters without having to manually implement the same logic as get converter to figure out which one would be selected for you, to figure out ordering or something like that.
You just would have to cast it though, right?
Yeah, you'd have to inspect it to say, okay, what do you derive from? Is this the one that I wanted? Whatever. I don't honestly have a good scenario for that. For the case called outside of a converter, but I assume some people might want to.
You would have to do something like get converter, type of something, and then say dot as whatever. And then the space as, JSON converter of some specific type, right?
And then you can call the read and write APIs on that.
You can call the read and write APIs for that.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Which means you have to know something about that converter, right? Like you can't just randomly do it for random converters, probably.
But also, if this thing returns null, what is your fallback? Okay, I'm writing a converter. I don't know. I hit a type that I don't know how to convert.
Well, one option is you just throw an exception that says, "Do you need to register a converter for that?" I don't know how to handle this type.
Okay.
This is not my problem. This is your problem to figure out.
Okay. That makes sense.
Like I said, it's optional. I needed to do something like this when I was prototyping the key value pair converter, because the T key and T value options are, like was asked earlier, I don't, the converter doesn't care what they are, just wants to convert them.
I mean, it kind of makes sense if you think about, let's say you want to do the F# thing where you say, I can do discriminated unions, right? You know how to, detect the discriminated union, you know how to do the case switch, but then you don't know how to do student versus person.
Yeah.
You just say, you give me the person or student converter, but I know how to do the, the surrounding JSON and that's basically how you would implement that.
Could there be a potential problem in like recursive calls with this or no?
Recursive between what?
Like your converter calling get converter, getting in and calling a read method on that converter, and now it's stuck in a recursive.
Well, ideally, if you're getting a converter for a list of person, the list of person converter would need to call back in here in order to figure out what to do. I mean, you could also do that at try read and try write time, but that might end up being more expensive than doing it here.
Okay, cool.
That's why I would like to see the sample code
Yeah.
that we discussed earlier.
Yeah, I think I'll paste the key value pair example once I have that done into here.
All right. Then
Okay. Thanks everyone. I guess we're out of time, right?
we're out of time, and I think it seems like we covered everything.
Yeah, it makes A lot
Okay,
more
I'll
sense.
update out, and I don't think there's anything controversial, so it's up to you guys whether we want another meeting or not, or email.
No, I think I'm done with this one. Like, if you have some, I mean, I think we made the decision what to do with this API at this point,
Yeah.
Okay.
and so
Sounds
Yeah. Why wouldn't it just be approved?
like I would, yeah, I did just mark it as approved. I pasted the feedback in, and now it's done.
Yay.
Okay.
Sweet.
Yeah.
All right,
It only took a few months, but that's fine.
good things take time. All right,
I've had API reviews stagnant since November, so whatever.
all right. Bye, folks online.